Hi guys, welcome back to History 240. So, couple things that we need to get taken care of. First and foremost, I have not gotten your grading done, which is really bad, and I am so sorry. So my plan is for this weekend to sit down and take a look at everything that you guys have done over the last couple of weeks and get everything in so you'll know what your grade is prior to going into the next test. Now, this is the last little bit of material that we're going to cover before your next exam. So make sure that if you have any questions or if there's something you don't understand, that you email me and you get a hold of me so that way we can kind of work it out and we can figure out strategies for you to be able to succeed on your next test. So that being said, same principles as last time for the test. So you'll get one chance, and you'll have same point amounts, same amount of questions. All of that's going to be exactly the same. So make sure that you're studying the people, the places, the terms. Don't worry too much about names and dates, but if you want to learn them, they can maybe help you guys a little bit on the next test. I'm not going to say that it's going to be super helpful. Most of the time, my questions don't have like dates on them anyway. So, make sure that you're taking a good look at those people, those places, and those terms. Get a highlighter. Highlight the people, highlight the places, highlight the terms. Don't just go off of what I'm talking about on the slides. Think about what we're talking about in lecture here and the overall grand scheme of things. I want to be able to see that you guys are thinking a little bit. But, for this test, it's just solely going to be people, places, and terms. And so, hopefully this test will go well. I know that for the first test, sometimes it's a little intimidating because you guys don't really know what to expect. But now that you've taken a test with me, you know what is going to be on the test, you know what to expect. So it should be a little easier for you to take this test this time because you know what to expect. So that being said, let's get on to World War I. So many people have heard about World War I, I'm hoping. So we're going to look at World War I from a particularly Kentucky perspective, and then I'm going to throw in a bank robber in there just for fun. Because why not, right? So let's go to World War I. Let me see here. So, World War I starts in July in 1914 for us, ends in November of 1918. There were over 70 million military personnel involved altogether. Over 16 million people die as a result of the war, and this includes everything from genocide victims of the Ottoman Empire to casualties of just your average everyday citizens to military personnel. Everything is encompassed in here. So the conflicts are between the Allies, who are also called the Triple Entente. That's usually, the Entente is a French term. And usually it's considered to involve Russia, France, and the UK. And then later on, you'll have the US, Italy, and Japan enter in later. After that, you'll have the Central Powers, who the Allies are fighting against, as the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And then sometimes they throw Bulgaria in there, and Italy is in there part of the time, but not the whole time, and then they kind of move over to the Triple Entente. So, I mean, but we're not worried about Italy. We're looking solely at Kentucky here. So this is all triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. And they're assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia, by a guy named Gavrilo Princip. And he's a Yugoslavian nationalist. So what this means is that there's some infighting within Yugoslavia, and he is wanting to withhold power against the Austrian nation, who's kind of trying to step in and take control of those areas. But that's really not particularly important. it's really more deeply involved than what I can really go into here. So we'll move on from there. And while the war mainly takes place in Europe, it spreads into Asia, into Africa, into the Pacific. It kind of goes all over the place. And the reason why it does this is because most of the places that are involved are empires at this point. So they have territory holdings outside the mother country. So, for example, the U.S. is still considered an empire by many from the fact that we have territories in the Caribbean. So, you know, those places like Guam in the Pacific, you know, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, those places are considered to be part of our empire. Well, the same thing is going on in if with France and with the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has some areas in the Caribbean that they're still part of, and that they still have control over. France still has some in the Caribbean. They still have a lot in Asia, and the Great Britain also has some in Africa. France has some colonies in Africa. So we're still dealing with the age of colonialism at this point, and that's why a lot of these issues will spread into those areas. So I'm going to talk to you about some classic characteristics of World War I. So big things that happen that are really large technological advances and that really kind of change the face of war. So you're seeing trench warfare pop up, the immersion of the tank, the trading out of old tactics for new technologies. So, for example, at the beginning of this war, you're still having, okay, you line up on one side, I'll line up on one side, and we'll shoot at each other and we'll see what happens. And that's really changing at this point because of things like poison gas and trench warfare, more powerful guns, guns that shoot more quickly. You know, you don't have to worry about trying to reload, you know, these black powder rifles where you've got to take a bullet and some gunpowder and shove them down in a rifle and then pack it all in and then hope to goodness it goes off and it doesn't blow your hand off. You don't have that anymore. So what we're seeing is higher casualties, but at the same time, we're starting to see some of those Civil War tactics kind of coming out here. So in the videos, they talked about Grant and how he was starting to worry more about tactical gain than he was about having many casualties. That is continuing to play out here in World War I, and it will play out more fully because of that. So initially, the U.S. has a non-intervention policy for World War I. World War I starts in Europe prior to the United States ever going into it. The United States doesn't enter into World War I until 1917. So officially, we have a non-intervention policy, which means that we're not going to involve ourselves at all in the war in Europe. This is a European war. This is an our war. We're not going to get into any portion of it until there's the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which really starts negotiations about the U.S. entering the war. And the reason why they do this is because there are 128 U.S. civilians on the ship. This isn't a military ship. This is a cruise liner. This is a ship that's solely for the purpose of transporting people from one side to the other of the Atlantic. And when these 128 U.S. civilians die, it calls into question the ethics of Germany and why Germany should be worrying about these passenger ships, and should the U.S. Take any kind of involvement in this with these passenger ships that are going down. And so that happens around the beginning of May in 1915. And so what the U.S. does is it says, okay, the U.S. now has a non-toleration policy for unrestricted warfare on passenger ships. So the U.S. will not tolerate Germany attacking passenger ships. If it's a military ship, have at it. If it's a passenger ship, no, can't touch it. So, in January, just 2 years later, in 1917, Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. And this is where the U.S. enters. And there are seven U.S. merchant ships sunk. Now, that being said, there's also some interplay between Mexico and Germany and whether or not they should become part of the war in Europe. And from about the time of about 1917 to the end of the war, there's this question of whether or not Mexico is going to enter the war. Mexico never enters the war. But the main reason why historians think they don't enter the war is because it's not in a good political state itself at this time. And so the German foreign minister, his name is Arthur Zimmermann, kind of invites Mexico into the war by promising to help fund them in taking back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And he sends this out in a little telegram, and he says, okay, well, if you guys will attack the United States, then we'll help fund you taking back these territories. But it's intercepted by some people who are kind of going around and catching these telegrams and those kinds of things. There's a whole like group of people who were sitting there intercepting or attempting to intercept communications from Germany and their allies and trying to decipher them and you know, kind of use those for tactical advantage. And this one just so happened to work. So it's intercepted by the UK, and it's presented to Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at the time, and it's what he calls the casus belli, which means the cause of the war. It's a Latin phrase. And so when the U.S. declares war on April 6th of 1917, immediately the U.S. starts ramping up for war mode. And they'd been mildly ramping up for war mode prior to this, but it really doesn't take effect until April of 1917. So they initiate the Selective Service Act, which is essentially the draft. And they say, okay, we need 2.8 million men by the summer of 1918. And so you've got about approximately 10,000 men a day being sent to France. So with this, I mean, you guys can imagine the scale of drafting that needs to happen to have 10,000 men go to France per day. So, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, you've got essentially a year. They want it by summer of 1918. It's April, so it's late spring 1917 at the point where they declare war on Germany. So within a year, they've got to get 2.8 million men over into France. And to kind of boost this and to keep the men coming over to France, there is the process of turning Puerto Rico into a more legitimized kind of territory. So what they'll do is they'll grant them citizenship, and they'll do this strictly for the purpose of getting draftees under the Jones, and I hate this guy's name, and hopefully I get his name right. It's the Shafroth Act. So the Jones-Shafroth Act initiates Puerto Rico coming into the United States solely for the purpose of drafting. Okay, so let's move on from here. Give me just 1 second. So, with this, you have more than 60,000 men from Kentucky in the military service. It's slightly more according to, and different sources will tell you different things, of course, but according to the National Guard History's E-Museum, it's around 84,000 rather than about 60,000. Which is a fairly large discrepancy, and I'm not entirely sure why there's such a discrepancy. You know, with medieval documents, you've got to wonder about you know, who's writing them and what they're writing them for, and maybe is there a little bit of bias for why they're writing them, and that maybe would explain the differences in like such large quantities. But I'm not really sure why this is happening in the early 20th century. But we do know that there are at least 11,000 Black men who enter into the service, and from those, about 890 die from the conflict. So Black men are usually relegated to fairly menial roles in the military. Um, or they're forced out completely out of military service due to fairly racist politics. Now, when I say racist politics, you've got to understand that I'm looking at this from a modern perspective. So when you look at this time, and you kind of take the perspective of the people who are living in that time, they wouldn't consider this particularly racist. They don't consider it, I mean, yeah, it is degrading by our standards, and it was degrading to the standards of the people who were African American at the time, and this is part of the reason why we grow into having a civil rights movement. But these are politics that are going over the entire United States. This isn't, you know, just one selective area of groups of people being racist and, you know, hillbilly hilljacks. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is really more of racial ideology, of superiority playing into who gets put into what positions within the military. You know, it does have a bad connotation from our modern perspective, but at this time, most would not have seen this as a particularly bad perspective. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're going through these and we're talking about African Americans in the future, and when we're talking about African Americans in this sense. Just kind of keep that in mind, that racial ideology plays a huge role in understanding the early 20th century and even prior to that. So, and this is nationwide. It's not just the South. It's not just, you know, Kentucky. It's not just below the Mason-Dixon line. It's not just out west. There are issues all over the country with the idea of racial ideology and racial superiority. Even during the Civil War, the idea that Black men should be allowed to vote. Yes, Black men should be allowed to vote, according to abolitionists in the North. That didn't mean they wanted them marrying their daughter. So, you know, there is still a sense of racism, even in those really fairly altruistic groups of people. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we're discussing this, okay? So the 369th of New York was assigned to the French army, and this is really kind of strange because it's an all-black group of men, and so rather than putting them with the United States fighters and saying, okay, you guys are officially American soldiers, what ends up happening is that they get attired with French paraphernalia. They're put in the French army. The only thing that they have that's really from the United States is their uniforms, strictly their uniforms. Everything else is French. So, you know, like the gun they carry, the bag they carry, the hats that they're wearing, you know, they're all French. But many of them are from Kentucky. And they're known as the Harlem Hellfighters, and they fought as part of the French 16th Division. They end up earning a medal called the Croix de Guerre, which is the Cross of War, and it is a really, really high honor in French medals, from my understanding, from what I've read. And the name Harlem Hellfighters is actually given to them by the Germans because they never gave up ground and they never had a man captured. So, you know, this isn't accolades coming from the United States. This is the accolades coming from the enemy. They had the longest deployment of any American unit during the war. And one person really kind of stands out with this, and he's actually from Lexington. So you've got Vertner Woodson Tandy, and he's the first black officer's candidate to pass the officer's exam. Like I said, he's from Lexington. And then you've got 22 others who are part of this group that are from Lexington alone. You've got some kind of spread out from other places, but Lexington really seems to be the place where they're getting a lot of these members from. And then just outside of this kind of spectrum of who the soldiers were and where they're coming from and that kind of thing, it's important for us to talk about the places where they're training and things like that. So Camp Zachary Taylor is established in 1917, and it's established right outside Louisville. There are approximately 150,000 soldiers who are trained there. And so in 1917, there's a debate over whether or not the United States should enter the war. And Louisville is particularly divided about this. Up until May of 1917, when a German sub shot a torpedo at a cargo ship that was owned by a Louisville cargo company. And it was owned by a fellow named C.C. Mengel and his brothers. And there's no evidence that they were doing anything particularly related to war. This kind of goes back to that idea of unrestricted submarine warfare, where they're just kind of saying, all right, if you enter into our area, you're dead. No questions asked. So until that point, Louisville's kind of divided. After this, Louisville almost unanimously supports the United States going to war. And so they will help to establish Louisville, the people of Louisville will kind of help establish this Camp Zachary Taylor. And there'll be more of an influx of people going into the war because of Camp Zachary Taylor being so close, and because of this warship that torpedoes this cargo ship. So very quickly after that, the Spanish flu epidemic will hit in 1918. And this Spanish flu epidemic will hit all over the United States. But the issue is that it's killing people that it doesn't normally kill. So 824 soldiers alone are killed in 1918. So the thing about this is that normally the flu will kill children, small children, and the elderly. Well, for this flu, it wasn't doing that. It was killing young, healthy people. And historians believe somewhere around 1/5 to 1/3 of the human population died because of this Spanish flu epidemic. So not only is it hitting the United States and it's hitting Kentucky, it's hitting all over the world. And so you've got, issues with where is this coming from? Who's it coming from? How's it being spread? What are we going to do about this? And our understanding of how germs worked was not great at this time. It's not great. I mean, we're still talking about the same era, essentially, where you've got people reaching in and grabbing bullets out of holes, like they did in the Civil War. We're not far removed from that. We're only 50 years ahead in the future, essentially. So, just keep that in mind, that, our understanding of the flu and how the disease spread is not good. And you can see, based on some of these pictures that I've got here, you've got newspaper clippings. So with this newspaper clippings, they're banning funerals. So, if your cousin dies, you can't go to your cousin's funeral. Libraries are closed. Gyms are closed. Schools are closed. They're closing anything that you can possibly think of to try to contain this a little bit. And we don't have the flu shot at this point. We don't have any of the kinds of things that might make it easier for people to survive the flu. There's no Tamiflu at this point. I don't even think antibiotics have been discovered at this point, but antibiotics don't work on the flu anyway, so, there's not any of those kinds of things that would maybe help with that. But regardless, somewhere around 1/3 of the population died. as a direct effect of the flu, and this is worldwide. So the last veteran of World War I, his name was Henry Lex, and he dies in Louisville in 2009. So, not long after this, there's an armistice signed, which is essentially a treaty between September and November of 1918. Now, something that I found that was kind of cool is that there's this thing that says usgwarchives.net. And this is a really cool site where you can kind of go in and click on your county, find out what county you were in, and, you know, look at family members or people who may have served in the war. So you'll just kind of go down through your county, and you can click on your county, and you can click on people's names, and it'll bring you up to pictures of them, and you can see pictures of them, and you can find out how they died, and that kind of stuff. And you'll be surprised how many die of disease rather than dying of their wounds or something like that. It's really amazing, actually. So we're going to move on to post-war Kentucky after I get another sip here. Okay, and my computer's not responding. What's going on here? So I think I may have just done something strange to my computer. Give me just 1 second. Alright guys, I think I got it figured out now. Turns out that using my computer is a little more complicated than I know. I'm not particularly computer savvy, so thank you guys, by the way, for being so patient with my computer ineptitudes over this semester. So I know it's been rather frustrating, and I'm really sorry about that. But thank you guys for being patient. So let's get back to the lecture now. So let's talk about post-war Kentucky, because that's fun. So we've got a couple of good-sized political debates going on at this point. So we're getting ready to come into the Depression, and we're in what's considered the Roaring Twenties, which for most people in the United States, there are a lot of people who have like a whole lot of money, and then you've got some that have just a little bit of money, and then you've got a few people where you're really seeing a increase in the middle class. This isn't going to last. And essentially what's happened here is the same thing that's happening, or that has happened back with the recession, only it happened on a larger scale. Now, I don't know how many of you guys are old enough to really grasp what happened with the recession, but essentially what's going on is that we've got a lot of deficit spending. We've got a lot of issues with housing bubbles and prospecting and things like that that are going on. Buy cheap, sell high. So with this, we've got something similar going on. But it's just slightly different with when we get into the Depression. So essentially what we've got starting into the 1920s is that we're starting to see progressive attacks on gambling. So the Progressive Party has anti-gambling attacks starting in around the 1920s. And these are born out of kind of like a religious atmosphere and an attack on politics and political machines. And this is kind of where a political leader will take his followers and his supporters and the businesses associated with them, and he will attempt to win political office by giving incentives and rewards to those who are supporting him. And depending on where we're talking about at this point, and depending on where you're employed, this will make a really big difference in how you vote and how political and electoral things happen. So let's start off with Bruce Helm, because he's really the one who starts most of these anti-progressive attacks in around the 1920s. So he is from the Louisville Churchmen's Association. He and his ideas of anti-gambling and things like that will really get the majority of its support from rural areas, the KKK, fundamentalist fundamentalist Protestant clergymen. So those who were pastors of Protestant churches and their followers. And we'll see Congressman Alvin Barkley really start taking the lead with an anti-gambling campaign. And he almost became the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in 1923. But he was also campaigning against special mining interests, so that really kind of hurt him in that election. But he ends up being elected to the Senate regardless. And in 1926, like I said, he'd be elected to the Senate by popular election. And then in 1927, former Governor J.C.W. Beckham will win the Democratic Party nomination for the anti-gambling candidate. But he'll lose to the Republican Flem Sampson. And this will really mark the end of the progressive era in Kentucky. And so we'll start seeing more solely Democratic and Republican candidates coming onto the spectrum rather than, somebody who's progressive and Democratic or something along those lines. And so in 1937, he became the Senate leader, and he will run for vice president in 1948, and and this will be under President Harry S. Truman. So Alvin Barkley has a really, really large and long political career. And most people know him most closely by his 1938 a senatorial election where he will go up against Happy Chandler. And this is right during the middle of the Great Depression. So the way that they plan on attacking the Great Depression is very different. But we've not gotten to the Great Depression yet. So let's move on to it now. So with the Great Depression, this is not just something that happens in the United States. This is a severe worldwide economic depression, and it starts generally considered around 1929 and goes through about 1941. Arguably, there are issues in Kentucky that are exacerbated and will continue to exacerbate the Great Depression. So, you've got drops in crop prices, like we talked about with the night riders. We've got issues with monetization. We've got issues with coal camps starting to pop up. We've got issues with, all kinds of things. So there is an argument that the Great Depression starts in Kentucky a little bit earlier than 1929, but that's the accepted date, is from 1929, October of 1929. And so we're reaching really, really close to a big anniversary here, it looks like. But that's okay. So the gross domestic product under this depression will drop by 15%. So what the United States is producing will drop by 15%. In the recession in 2008-2009, it drops by only 1%. That's a big difference. And so you can see how the depression is so much worse than the recession, and why this has made such a big impact. So U.S. unemployment will reach 25%, and it's currently somewhere around 5%, and it peaked in 2009 during the recession at about 10%, which was about the last time that I was unemployed, and it drove me crazy. So, that being said, I remember during the recession, I worked retail at the time, and I moved from the Ashland area to Cincinnati to go to school. And I remember it being really difficult to find a job and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, what could this have been like during the Great Depression? And I remember being friends with people who, knew somebody who knew somebody who lost their job. And it's different in the Great Depression because not only is it somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who lost a job, but it's really hitting home for a lot of people because you'll have mass unemployment. There's no protection. Bank failures are just crazy. So people are losing their entire life savings on top of being unemployed and on top of having, no forms of social security, of having things that can kind of help to mitigate some of those issues. And the areas that are hardest hit are areas that are generally associated with Kentucky. So heavy industry, construction, farming, mining, and timber. And the latter two are known as primary sector industries because they deal with the raw resources. And then the other ones are secondary sector industries. But even still, these industries are really heavily hit. So, there's a question, because we're having issues prior to this, on whether or not the crash in October of 1929, and this crash is known occasionally by Black Tuesday. Is it a side effect? Is it the cause? Is it just the catalyst? What's really going on here? And so I've included a video on here for you guys to watch that will kind of explain some economic policies. One of them is Keynesian policy, one of them is Austrian policy. So up to the point of the Depression, we're following a fairly Austrian-style policy. And then we've just gotten out of the war. So what we're seeing is we're kind of getting this mix back and forth of Keynesian policy and Austrian policy. Keynesian policy is a lot of government spending in things like war, stimulation, things that will put money into the economy. Austrian policy, on the other hand, is kind of like holding on to your money, spend as you go, the economy will kind of right itself after a time. Don't mess with it, don't put money into it, it's not the government's job. And so we've kind of got these fluxes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And what happens routinely is when you've got something like a war or some time when you're pumping a lot of money into the economy and then you just stop all of a sudden, you have a recession or a depression within, usually it's about 10 years. And so, that's heavily concerning for our politics for today, because we've got candidates who are going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between this idea of you've got to pump a lot of money into the economy to get it going, and then taking money away from it. So think about the Democrats and their political platforms and the Republicans, and think about their political platforms. One wants to cut spending, one wants to increase spending. And so when you have this kind of back and forth, you've got issues with where the economy is going to be. You've got issues with what's real inflation. What kind of bubble have we got going on now between the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, things where we're pumping money into certain items and then all of a sudden, pop, they're gone. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking at here, and just giving you overall perspective on kind of why we're seeing some of these things. Like for example, look at the difference between Clinton and Bush. So you've got a couple years of Clinton where we've got increased spending, and yeah, it's pumping money into the economy. But when you have somebody like Bush who comes in and takes over and stops that spending, then couple years after Bush is in office, bam, all of a sudden you've got a crisis on your hands. And this is the same thing that's happening here. So you've had World War I, you've had a couple of years, you've got a president who is really more of the Austrian persuasion. So, you know, he's planning on not putting a lot of money into the economy and not stimulating the economy, because it's not the government's job to stimulate the economy at this point. We'll see a shift from that, starting with the Great Depression. But it's not the government's job at this point. So I've posted this video that kind of explains a little bit about how Keynesian Austrian policy works and how it kind of plays out, and how you can see it happening in 2009 and back in 1929. So just keep that in mind. It should be a lot of fun. I think you guys will enjoy it. So let's talk about one other place that's being really heavily hit. So it's not only urban areas that are being hit by the Depression. A lot of people have this kind of misguided conception that the Depression only hits in places where, you know, there's a lot of industry and there's a lot of people. It's not the case. It's hitting rural areas very heavily. And there's an event that's known as Bloody Harlan. And this happens in Harlan County in Kentucky. And it's also called the Harlan County Coal War. So around 1931, February of 1931, Harlan County coal mine operators who are taking care of coal mines for large coal companies will begin selling coal at below cost in order to grow dependence and kind of like cover losses. And so they'll start deficit spending to try to increase people using coal because they think it's cheaper, when in reality they're just kind of slashing prices for a little while to get people to come and become dependent on it and really start using it as a natural resource. And so to make up for this deficit spending, they'll cut the wages of workers by around 10% per person. And a labor union called the United Mine Workers of America will step in to kind of organize and help coal miners really fight back for this, and you know, kind of take on these mine operators. And those who sympathized with the union or they joined a union were usually fired. And when you're fired, generally you're also evicted from your home because you live in a coal camp. And what happens with a coal camp is that as long as you're working for the coal company, you will have a place to live, and you will have, you know, access to your home, you'll have a job. But the second you get fired, you're evicted. And so now you're homeless on top of not having a job. And it's the middle of the Depression, so you don't know where you're going to get another job. And so you're out homeless with your family in the hills of West Virginia and Kentucky. And where are you going to go? It's a really bad situation. Others later on down the road will strike in sympathy for these people who have been fired. But that doesn't happen for a good long while. And at one point, at the peak of this war, it's not really technically a war, but at the peak of this, you'll have about 5,800 workers on strike and only about 900 working total in Harlan County altogether. And these people who are working despite the unions will be called scabs. And so the working men will be protected by private mine guards, with usually a county deputy's privileges, and they will use this under a fellow named Sheriff J.H. Blair. So one of the union organizers, his wife, had a highly influential song for this time, and she really just is kind of an amazing woman. But this man, Sam Reese, is an organizer, like I said, for the United Mine Workers. And essentially what happens is he's coming home from trying to organize one night. And he pulls up outside and there's a car sitting there, and he's like, oh, that's kind of weird. So he, kind of drives off. And so what'll happen is some of these mine guards and a few other people will go into his home where his wife and his kids are, and say, where's your husband? Where's he at? We want to have him. Give him to us. And his wife thinks, oh, they're going to murder my husband. And so she'll tell him she doesn't know where he's at. She doesn't at this point. He hasn't made it home. He's supposed to be home by now. But he's not there. So what she'll do is, after she eventually gets rid of them, after they've sacked her home and they've gone through and they've ripped up everything, destroyed everything, trying to find this guy, she'll write a song, and she actually writes it on a calendar, which is kind of fun, called Which Side Are You On? Her name's Florence. And it'll be in response to the way that Harlan County in general has been treated, and the way that her husband has been treated. And this video, it's a really neat video, and you can actually hear Florence singing it, Florence herself singing it, on the link that I've got just below this little blurb here. And in May of 31, you'll see this really coming to a head under the Battle of Everts, where you've got miners who are ambushing cars that just so happen to be carrying company men, and they'll shoot them and kill them. It's a hazard. But it just so happened that they had company men hanging out in there. And so the Kentucky National Guard will be called in response to this, to break up these picket lines and this civil unrest, and to stop the strike. And then on May 24th, just shortly after this, there will be a rally that will be tear gassed, and J.H. Blair, the sheriff, will revoke the right to assemble. And he'll essentially kill anybody who's in resistance. And so by about June, all the mines are back in operation. And so this calls into question the difference between repression and oppression. With this, you can really see that this is almost an oppressive kind of thing, where these repressed miners are saying, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. I can't make it work with you cutting my wages by 10%. I mean, for me, that would be a sizable chunk of change. And so, you've got to think of this under the context of a lot of these people. They've got kids. They're being paid in this flimsy, practically useless money that the coal camps are issuing out, and it's called company script. So there's a song called 16 Tons that really kind of speaks to this. And essentially what they're saying is that, the money is worthless. You work 16 tons and you get 16 tons of coal out of the mines, and what do you get? You get nothing for it. You get another year older and deeper in debt. So you're paying all of this money back to the company store. So you're essentially having to borrow for the things that you absolutely have to have, because you're not making enough money to be able to get the things that you need, and then you can't go anywhere else because you don't have enough money to go anywhere else. And so you're paying this money that you're getting, this useless money, back to the company store. And so you're already kind of like deficit spending already, because you don't have the kind of money to be able to do that. and to like continue that process. So again, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Sounds like the life of a student, does it not? But regardless, the mines become operational again. And so the Communist National Miners Union will attempt to kind of step in and take over where the United Mine Workers kind of fall apart. But they'll fail to do this due to distrust in their ideology based on the fact that they're communist. And they'll be disheartened by the attitudes of the workers. And so they'll kind of just say, all right, we get it, back out. And so they leave. And then, so a little while later, under the National Industrial Recovery Act, this will give workers rights to organize, and it will outlaw discrimination and firing based on union membership, which is really important. So with this, something else that you guys need to understand is that about half of Harlan's coal mine operators ran open shops from that point forward. And so it'll allow unions to be there, but it doesn't mandate it. So they'll say, okay, if you want to join a union, yeah, sure, you can join a union. You're not going to be fired for joining a union, but you don't have to join a union. Wink, wink. You know, don't join a union. Unions are bad. Don't join the union. Is kind of what they're saying with that. So moving on from that, that's pretty much it for what's kind of going on in Kentucky at this time during the Depression. The only other thing that you really need to know is that the senatorial election between Alvin Barkley and Happy Chandler is that, you know, this is huge. Anybody who wants to get into government at this point will want to ride on Roosevelt's coattails. And Happy Chandler and Alvin Barkley are both trying to do that. Alvin Barkley is supported by Roosevelt himself, but Happy Chandler is a really popular guy within Kentucky. You've got Alvin Barkley, who's already the Senate Majority Leader, versus Happy Chandler, who's only been a governor. So there's this real big toss-up between which one of these candidates would be better. And there are a lot of people who are not particularly fond of deficit spending, and that's kind of where Alvin Barkley is wanting to go to get more rapid relief. But on the other hand, he is being backed by Roosevelt. And so when Chandler kind of tries to jump in on that, it kind of backfires on him just a little bit. Because he's got this ideology of, you know, you're going to pay as you go. So when you get taxes in and you get money in, yeah, you fund work projects like the WPA and the TVA and things like that. But you don't really do any more than lip service to the New Deal. So, but beyond that, that's really about all you need to know. I don't think I'm going to go into the WPA and the TVA today, but I will say that if you guys want some really good primary source document analysis pieces, look at the WPA in Kentucky, and you can find some really cool stuff. There is actually, if you go to the Goodman-Paxton photographic collection, that's a really good primary source document analysis, because those are all WPA projects within Kentucky. So Works Progress Administration projects within Kentucky. And so you'll find things like your school in your hometown, the streets from your hometown where the WPA has paved or put up sidewalks or put in electricity lines or using a gravel quarry. You know, all of that stuff is there. So it's a really good resource, and you guys should absolutely check it out. And that'll give you some really good ideas for things that you can use for your primary source document analysis. So, moving on from there, I'm just going to cover one more thing tonight, and I just thought this was kind of cool because this guy is from just outside my hometown. So I grew up about 10 miles outside Ironton, Ohio, which is practically right across the river from Ashland, Kentucky. And there was this guy named William Miller, and he's also known as Billy the Killer Miller. So Billy the Killer Miller grew up in Ironton. He was born in 1906, and he gets in a fight with his brother over a girl. Note to the guys in the class, don't get in fights over girls. It's silly. But he kills his brother. And so he ends up avoiding punishment by, I think it was reason of insanity. He actually had a successful case of reason of insanity. But after this, he just kind of has like a mental breakdown. And so he'll go through and he'll start robbing banks in Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, or actually West Virginia is not part of this. So Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, and Oklahoma, which seems kind of spread out, but he's kind of like running from one territory to another. So after he robs some banks in Kentucky, he'll run up to Michigan, and after he finishes in Michigan, he'll run down to Oklahoma, and then after he runs out of places in Oklahoma, he'll come back to Ohio and Kentucky. And he'll meet up with a couple of fairly famous bank robbers like Pretty Boy Floyd and George Birdwell in about 1931. And right before his death, he will rob two banks. And one of them will be the Elliston Bank, a bank in Elliston, Kentucky, in April of 31. And he'll steal just slightly more than $2,200. And in the other one, it's in White House, Ohio, just a couple days after this, like a week later. And he'll steal $1,600. Which would be the equivalent of about $57,000 roughly in today's money. So it calls into question really whether or not it's worth it to rob a bank for $57,000. It's really not that much. But he does it. And he does it fairly regularly, so maybe he's rich and we're all missing something here. I wouldn't recommend it, but maybe we are. So after he robs these banks, he will make a run for it, and he'll be recognized in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And this will result in a shootout. So they'll be firing across the street, at each other, and, there'll be a gunfight. And Pretty Boy Floyd will attempt to save him, during the shootout, because Pretty Boy Floyd is involved in this shootout, but he ends up dying before Floyd can get to him, and so Floyd will make a run for it for Oklahoma. And that's pretty much it for the night. So guys, good luck. I'm going to try to get all of your stuff graded. I've got 152 assignments from you guys, so it's going to be a long weekend of grading. So hopefully all is going well other than this. If you have questions about tests or materials or things that you can use for primary source document analysis, let me know and I will kind of point you guys in the right direction. So have a good week and thank you guys. So see you guys later. Bye.